Grüß, willkommen in einem aufregendes video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 25 of my figure gaming video series. In this video I'll be discussing basing 6mm World War II or Cold War figures. This presentation covers figure basing ideas and how to achieve different basing outcomes. Many gamers do not base their 6mm figures, and I was one of them for many years. However, I came to the realization that basing your figures was the best strategy, especially if playing platoon or higher scale rules. These rules require elements to have a specific frontage, thus they generally require basing. Coupled with this reason was storage. Once they are based, an element can be stored in my felt covered boxes with spaces 3 centimeters wide. This allows you to tightly fit your figures into them. This protects your figures and allows you to transport them without the risk of them being damaged. I used to have to carry my figures around by aircraft, so this was a fairly important issue that I had to grapple with. These days I don't do that so much, so it's not so important. However, the final reason and the final trigger was that I kept on forgetting what my figures were. By basing them, I could identify the figure on the bottom of the base. Even for those players who do not base their figures, they still have to base infantry and artillery, so this is something they still need to deal with. This shows you my older basing system, which I have to admit I'm not very happy with. The base is cardboard and it can warp. The flock is too coarse and simply does not look attractive when you look at it close up. From a distance, maybe it could pass, but once you start looking closely or taking photographs of it, it looks awful. My original objective was to always use a flock similar to the flock on my terrain, and I must admit, when you look at a whole playing area with elements on it, it does kind of look acceptable. So that basic principle was a good basic principle. It's just I picked flock that was too light coloured and too coarse. However, I quickly noticed that when I came close up, particularly if I took photograph, and specifically for infantry, it simply didn't look very good. I started flocking Cold War forces, which had little infantry, so the problem was not so obvious initially, but once I started playing World War II games, the flaws became very obvious, as well as not giving me very good close-up photos, as you can see here. After a lot of experimentation over many years and lots of different rebasing efforts, I now use MDF bases with a two-tone high-quality woodland fine turf on it. I also changed my terrain system to use this system, and the effect overall is a lot better. As a general rule, I'm reasonably happy with this. For those who are more diorama-oriented, this is still very basic, but if your main focus is basically having a game and getting something that looks acceptable, I'm reasonably happy with this result. In my investigation experimentation, I downloaded a number of photographs from the internet to determine what other gamers were doing. In this example, infantry are being mixed with Soviet armour. The best thing about these bases was the use of grass patches. These are typical resin bases, which I'm personally not going to be adopting. While I'm not a fan of resin bases, these bases match the playing area terrain reasonably well, which is an important consideration when making your bases. This shows more photos of the brown resin bases with patches of grass. I'm uncertain what the bases are made of, but I suspect it's resin, which is thick, probably more than 2mm. The best thing about resin is that it allows you to merge your infantry into the base, thus avoiding their bases being visible. This looks good, but my playing area terrain is mainly green, so brown bases would not match, for me at least. This brings up an important point. The bases need to match your playing area terrain. Before deciding what base effect you wish, you need to confirm what kind of playing area you'll mainly be playing on. In this case, the bases match the playing area, as you can see in this photograph. So this player has certainly achieved that level of interior decorating skill, let's say. In this example, this also uses grass patches, but the bases seem to be a brown flock and the edges of the bases are green. This would match a green playing area and would match my playing area terrain reasonably well. Again, I was struck at how effective a two-tone effect was. I feel this is a critical element of having a good base scheme. I do like these bases. This shows a range of different basing systems. Two are similar to what we've already seen, but the bottom right is interesting. Part of one base displays the vehicle type. This is something I always wanted to avoid, which is writing on the bases. While I understand why players do this, I feel it does not look good at all. I feel the vehicle type can be placed on the bottom of the base, something which I will show later in the video. On the left is an excellent base of infantry with a mortar. Not only do we see the two-tone effect, but also some extra features, which in this case are boxes of ammo. The top two images are standard green two-tone bases with infantry, although on the right the brown edges are not ideal. Obviously this base was painted brown and then clumps of grass added to it. I think retaining green edges, like the figure on the left, is better, but both are nice bases. I'm not going to say otherwise. The two lower bases look like very large bases with 6mm figures on them. These are almost diorama and they look very nice indeed. I'm uncertain if I would go to this effort or exactly what kind of rules they would be used with, but I certainly do consider the workmanship here as excellent. This shows more examples of two-tone bases on the top, brown bases with green glass. The bottom are single-tone, but with interesting contrast effects on the base. My preferences are the bases at the top left. That looks really good, although the top right certainly nothing to sneeze at either. This shows a multi-tone desert base which is incredibly detailed. The terrain looks like resin, but the actual bases look like very thin MDF. They could even be metal. Many gamers base figures on thin metal, which can stick to a magnet. They use this for storage purpose, and that system is very good. I personally don't like metal bases because the flock comes off too easily, but if you can manage to overcome that, this is a good mechanism to both base and also allow you to store figures. This shows more detailed desert-themed bases, in this case with some grass included and infantry wandering around the vehicles. I'm uncertain if I would mix infantry with vehicles unless it's a headquarters, but at a headquarters, or as a headquarters, these would look extremely good. This base is very interesting. I have no idea how the yellow-brown effect is done, but it looks really good. The base is very thick. I suspect it's 3mm MDF. We once again see more two-tone bases, and once again I do not know how the rocky effect is done here. These also look really good. As a warning to my viewers, I'm not going to this level of detail, so if you wish to copy this effect, you need to work out how it's done yourself. These shows rather large bases, perhaps 5 centimeters wide, maybe even 6 centimeters wide. Once again, nice diorama, and it shows what you can do if you want to use 15mm size bases for your 6mm figures. The grass effect is very nice as well. These bases are moving towards what I'm personally thinking of. The green looks like a kind of flock which is run over some type of rocky material. The base in the centre left with the green edges would suit my playing area, and I really like it. These figures may not be part of the World War II image that I'm trying to portray, but they do look rather interesting. Once again, using green tufts of grass to give you an almost diorama impact or effect. Let's now look at making some of these bases. I have to admit I'm stealing some instructions from another video. The link to that video is in the title, and I certainly do recommend people go in there and take a look at it because it's actually quite informative. I'll try and make sure it's in the YouTube description as well so you can check it out. Here we have an MDF base, which could be 2mm thick or 3mm thick. I use I used to use 2mm cardboard, then moved to 2mm MDF, and now use 3mm MDF for my 6mm figures. First, the base is painted with a black-grey, not a pure black, and it's more a slate grey or very dark green. I personally use NATO green, but the key point is the base colour will influence the final base, so select it wisely. If using cardboard, you should consider using coloured sheets of paper glued to the cardboard, or at least that's certainly another option you could look at. I used to paint the base, but found painting cardboard can sometimes warp it. This is not an issue with MDF, but nonetheless, even with MDF, I tend to spray all my paint these days. The first flock layer uses woodland dirt, which is a dark brown fine flock. I normally place the highlight flock on first, a blob in the centre of the base. Tap the base so it spreads and then cover it with the primary flock colour. The glue used is a hobby glue, which dries slowly and is not as thick as my exterior wood glue. Make sure the glue is fully dry before going to this step or the next step. Parts of the base, which currently has a dirt-like colour, is dabbed with watered-down craft glue, and then a middle green fine flock is added. This is a darker green than I would normally use, but does look good. Make sure the glue is fully dry before going to the next step. In this case, you do get a two-tone effect, which is more 3D, which is nice. The next step is to place some multicoloured rocks on the base. The rocks are railway ballast, and you should try and find a range of colours. In the video, super glue is used, but I suspect this can be done better with exterior PVA wood glue. Spread out the rocks and the final effect is very good. I'd keep the rocks away from the centre as much as possible, otherwise your vehicle will not set well on the base. I would personally miss this step, but if you wanted to go down the path, at this point in the video some wood shavings are added. The wood shavings were created by blending in a blender dried leaves. Watered down craft glue is used here. The final layer is clumpy green flock using craft glue. Only a few spots are done and the result has some depth, which is a good look. I normally use a very light green brush flock, and before I do this I spray the base with a watered down solution of PVA to ensure the base flock does not flake off. However, in my case I normally add this stage after I've put the figure on, just to make sure it doesn't get in the way of me putting the figure onto the base, but it's a player preference. The final step is to place the figure on the base. You need to first press the model on the base to make sure it sits flat on the base. Craft glue is used, but in this case I'd use a hardware PVA glue as it's a bit stronger, or even super glue as a possible consideration. However, if you're using those better glues or high quality glues, better make sure the basing is your final basing. Normal PVA can be actually dissolved off if you sit in water. The other glue's a bit harder. Nonetheless, this looks very good. I originally felt this was too dark, but I've now changed my mind. Dark bases, well done, provide very good results. I originally used the system I've just described for my flocking, but I have changed some of the details. I now cover the bases with glue and first place a blob of highlight flock on it, either very dark or very light. I then tap the base around to spread it and cover it then with the base flock, either earth blend or green blend. I do not press the base into the flock anymore, which, while pressing it works, I found it was not really required. The only trick is the colour of the base must match the flock. I normally spray my bases with NATO green and it works perfectly well. Actually, any kind of green will work. Now, the one thing is, using this system, you don't get so much of a 3D effect, unlike the previous basing system, but I tend to prefer this sort of a flatter approach because my figures can fit on the bases a little bit easier. While I've changed my system many times, there are some basic rules which always apply. The bases must match the playing area. You need at least two-tone effect. 3 is possible, but maybe a bit too busy. The pattern must not be too busy. In this example, the brown patches are far too busy. I now only have one large blob and it looks a lot better. Placing brushes on the base really enhances the base. I use woodland brush, and there's lots of other solutions as well you may want to consider. You can really go overboard, but as I have so many figures, I prefer a simpler system which gives me the effect I want without too much effort. Most instructions that you'll find on the internet always suggest that you start with a dark colour on the base and then layer lighter flock colours over it. Originally, I disagreed with this and went the other way, but you know what? In the end, I totally agree with that suggestion. Players can choose whatever system they feel gives them the best result. My initial objection, originally I never used MDF, I used cardboard, and my initial objection to MDF was its thickness. However, I've found 2mm MDF bases which are available from the UK. After much experimentation, I discovered thin bases were a lot harder to pick up, especially infantry. For World War II, I use a lot of infantry, and after a while I came to the conclusion that 3mm thick MDF was the best solution for 6mm figures, and I don't look back. The company I currently use is War Bases, which has a very wide range of bases and movement trays. Almost all bases I use are 3x3 or 3x4 centimeters. The movement trays are also very good, and I use them for Napoleonics and Ancients. While today I exclusively use MDF bases, however, for players on a budget, cardboard is still a viable option. This shows some of my older cardboard-based figures. In this case, the flocking looks awful, but using woodland fine turf and the effect is a lot better even on cardboard. When I used to use cardboard, I typically use either 1.75mm or 2mm cardboard. This can be purchased in large size sheets from a craft shop. The 2mm cardboard is superior, but it's much harder to cut. 1.75 is easy enough to cut with my Scorpion dressmaking scissors, which is a brute. I use exterior PVA woodwork glue because it dries quickly and is very thick, so there is minimal moisture absorption. This shows the first stage of glue application. Make sure the glue covers every part of the cardboard. The last thing you need is the coloured sheets rising on your base. An alternative is to paint the bases. This works well, and I normally use watered down house paint for this. I have had problems with warping, but I must admit it's not super serious if you're rather careful. I mainly use cardboard to thicken my base, that is coloured cardboard to thicken my base. If I was using MDF, this would not be really required. Now I'm gluing a thin sheet of light brown paper on top of this. This gives me the colour which my flock will sit on top. I also use a light green and dark brown piece of thin cardboard. It all depends on the flock I'm placing on top of it. This shows my very old light green base, which I no longer use. The colour matches my playing area green, or my old playing area green, and was the main colour scheme I used in the old days. I later discovered this was far too light, so these days I use a dark green cover instead. It's critical to make sure the coloured sheet sticks fully to the cardboard. For this I use a number of heavy books, each of which is covered by plastic contact. PVA glue does not stick to clear plastic, so if the glue comes out at the edges it's not an issue. In this case I have two sheets under a book, and my brown sheet I will be covering by another book. In this case I use my trusty Conway's Fighting Ships to cap off all the other books because it's really heavy. The front of each element contains the colour that matches the flock, so that's what you've seen so far. On the rear I have the opportunity of placing a label which describes the figure on top of it. When I use MDF I have to cut out each label and glue it to the base, but that's still not much of an issue. It's important for me because, I sometimes I can't instantly identify the difference between a T34A and a T34C. This helps me identify the different figures or different main battle tanks. However, moving back to my cardboard bases, these are the bases after all the gluing has been conducted, and they've been cut out into 12 base strips. This shows one of the bases, or strips of bases, on its side. Cardboard is 1.75mm thick, with coloured paper on one side and the printed paper on the other. The thickness tends to average about 2mm. This shows one of the dangers of my system of using cardboard. If the glue is not spread correctly and pressed down enough, using books, it can lift. MDF does solve this, however, these are old figures and these days I never have this issue. Incidentally, these figures are homemade, which is why they're such poor quality. I use these figures for testing purposes, and I'll be using them to test out other new basing ideas. This shows another example of lifting, but the figure in the center is more typical. This is rather boring, which is why I'm looking at implementing a new basing system. The figures are homemade, so are poor quality. These are the scissors I used to cut my cardboard, and these are very dangerous scissors indeed. I have cut myself many times, and if you go down the route, I urge you to be very careful. Incidentally, these are huge, but it cuts through thick cardboard like hot knife through butter. The edges of the bases must be coloured. This can be done with paint or with a whiteboard marker. While a whiteboard marker is easier to use, I'm moving back to paint as the colour consistency is superior. But for people who lack a garage and are making their bases in a flat or house, this does allow you to avoid the use of paint. If you do not like cardboard and do not wish to spend too much money on laser cut bases, you can actually create homemade MDF bases. This shows at the top my cardboard bases and at the bottom some of my homemade MDF bases. The base on the right has been flocked. This shows my homemade bases flocked with figures placed on top of them. I have to admit I don't like this flocking arrangement, but it's two-tone and the figures are all homemade figures, so they don't particularly look that good. This shows the slightly out of focus close-up of the final base figures. The figures are all homemade, which I use to try out either painting schemes or basing schemes. These days I would edge the bases with a black felt tip marker, as I feel black is less visible than trying to match the base colour, but again it's player choices. If you want to go completely overboard, you can consider placing a label on the back of the base. It's not visible to your opponent, you can see what the figures are. I don't do this anymore, but it's certainly something you can consider. In this example, I've added some grass to the bases, which has a surprisingly, or gives me a surprisingly good effect. This gives you a nice 3D dimensional effect, and is another option to using, let's say, woodland brush, which is a sort of a plastic type material. Let's now look at the difference between a single tone and a two-tone system. This shows you some of my early desert terrain or bases, and it's a single tone, and quite frankly this looks really boring. This shows the same figures on a two-tone base. The image does not really do justice to the base, but I found the base begins to enhance the figure on it if you do a particularly good job. This is kind of the difference between a diorama and a model, I suppose. In this case, the bases are a bit too busy. I now use a single blob in the center, but nonetheless you can see that as soon as you add another tone, you really do add something to the base or the figure itself. I just wish to emphasize there are many different ways of creating bases. I've only covered a few of the simple and low-cost options. My later videos cover more complex and costly basing systems. So we come to an end of episode 25 of my figure gaming hobby series of videos, in this case covering a number of different suggestions you could consider in creating bases for your 6mm figures. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.